We cannot see it this year because they're renovating it and it is closed for the season. So our seniors this year will not see it. You more than likely will see the new renovated Peterson House. So because Lincoln would not survive a trip to the White House, the president was taken directly across the street from Ford's Theater to the second floor of the Peterson House. And we will come back to that story in a minute, but where are we going next? How about, no, not yet. How about the two other assassination attempts? Yeah, that's our next subtopic. What's going on with the two other assassination attempts that are supposed to be taking place when? At the same time. Now, remember those conspirators we talked about earlier? The two men that were assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward were Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne, and David Harold. They were the two assigned to kill Secretary of State Seward. Lewis Powell, or he sometimes is called Lewis Payne, and David Harold. So the two that were assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward were Lewis Powell, sometimes known as Lewis Payne, and David Harold, H-E-R-O-L-D. Those were two of those conspirators we talked about. They were the ones that were assigned to kill Secretary of State Seward. This is an interesting story. We got them down, Lewis Powell, or Payne, and David Harold, H-E-R-O-L-D. It's kind of an interesting story because when the two men arrived at the Secretary of State's residence, Harold stayed outside doing what? Holding the horse of Powell or Payne. Okay, so only Lewis Payne, we'll just go Lewis Payne from now on because it's too difficult. Only Lewis Payne goes in. David Harold stays and holds Payne's horse, okay, as they arrive at William Seward's residence. Well, Lewis Powell simply knocks on the door. And Seward's servant, who obviously was black, answers the door. So Powell knocks on the door, and Seward's servant answers. Well, Secretary of State Seward wasn't feeling very well, so Powell knocked on the door and told the servant that he was there to deliver medicine personally for the Secretary of State. Only he could give him the medicine. So he knocks on the door, the servant answers the door. He said, I'm here to personally give this medicine to Secretary of State Seward. Well, the servant thought that was a little weird. So he insisted on, no, you give it to me and I'll give it to him myself. Okay, he insisted on giving the medicine to him himself, this being the servant. So when Seward's servant insisted on taking the medicine himself up to the Secretary of State, Powell simply pushes by him and heads upstairs of the residence. Just pushes him out of the way and runs upstairs, knowing that the Secretary of State is probably up there in bed in his quarters because he's not feeling well. Well, once he gets upstairs, Powell runs into Seward's son, Frederick. And he tells him the same story. I'm here to personally deliver this medicine to Secretary of State Seward. And he tells this to Seward's son, Frederick, who is up there caring for his father. And what does Frederick say to him? I'll take it and give it to him. Okay? So once upstairs, Lewis Powell was confronted by Seward's son, Frederick, who also insisted on giving his father the medicine himself. You know what Powell does? Pulls out his pistol and fires at Frederick in an attempt to kill him, but the gun misfires. So Powell points his pistol at Frederick in an attempt to kill him, but the gun misfires. When it misfired, what do you think Powell did? close. He hit Frederick over the head with the butt of his pistol, fracturing Frederick's skull. So when the pistol misfires, Payne simply takes the butt of the pistol, wasn't a Derringer by the way, and hits Frederick over the top of the skull, fracturing his skull. Well, you know who's in Seward's bedroom caring for him inside the room? His daughter, Fanny. And she comes out of the father's bedroom when she hears all this commotion and sees what's going on. So Seward's daughter, Fanny, came out of her father's bedroom, sees the events, and what does she do? Screams. Okay? So she opens the door to her father's bedroom, sees what's going on with her brother, and screams. And she's basically not good for anything at that point. She's hysterical, and she's not going to form any resistance, right? So what does Powell do? He sees Secretary of State Seward in his bed, recovering from a carriage accident, and he stabs Seward several times. He stabs at Seward several times. Each time he misses because Seward is so slight built. He misses him. He tries stabbing at him and misses him several times while he's laying in bed. Well, finally he gets his bearings, and Powell stabs Seward in the cheek and the neck, and then slashes him with his knife, wounds that would leave the Secretary of State disfigured for the remainder of his life. So after missing a few times, he ends up getting a stab in. He stabs him in the cheek and in the neck, and then slashes him with his knife. And these are wounds that would leave Secretary of State Seward disfigured for life. But he does not, what? Die. He does not die. And he leaves. Once he does that, he leaves, figuring what? That he's going to die. So that leaves us with what other assassination attempt? That of Vice President Johnson. Now, the man that was given the task to kill the Vice President was George Atzerodt. George Atzerodt. You probably have to go to your ID sheet to get his spelling. George Atzerodt was the guy that was assigned by Booth to kill Vice President Johnson. And the plan is that he's going to kill Vice President Johnson at his residence, which was known as the Kirkwood House. That's where the Vice President stayed in those days, the Kirkwood House. And we'll show you that when we get to D.C. It's not the same place now. So, George Atzerodt's given the charge of killing Vice President Johnson at his residence at the Kirkwood House. Now, Atzerodt wasn't a very good soldier because he lost his nerve and actually went out and got drunked up instead. Didn't even show up. So he loses his nerve to kill Vice President Johnson and proceeds to get drunk instead. How many people knew there was those other two? Yeah, so you might know it if you read a little bit about it, but a lot of kids don't know. And I think it's important you do. A lot of people don't know there was a kidnapping attempt first either. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the death of a president. The death of a president. We'll go back to the Peterson boarding house and tell you what happened there. The death of a president. Well, back at the Peterson house, there's no doubt President Lincoln is simply slowly dying. There's no hope for him. It is a mortal wound. He is simply laying in the Peterson house, dying a slow death. At his side will be his wife Mary and their older son Robert. Mary and their older son Robert, who, by the way, is buried in Arlington Cemetery with his family. You'll get a chance to see that as well when we're there. Now, they had a younger son named Tad. And the younger son named Tad, And they kept him at the White House because they thought he was too young to see his father in such poor shape. So Mary Lincoln is at the president's side. Their older son Robert is there. But Tad, the younger boy, the decision's made that he will stay at the White House because they believe he is too young and it would be too painful to see his father in such grave condition. More than 100 people visited President Lincoln during the night, including Vice President Johnson, who had no idea there was a planned assassination attempt upon him, and many members of Lincoln's cabinet. So more than 100 people visited Lincoln that night, including Vice President Andrew Johnson and several members of Lincoln's cabinet. He lives throughout the night and into the morning. However, at 7 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Lincoln's breathing slowed down considerably at 7 a.m. On April 15, 1865, the president's breathing slows down considerably. And then at 7:22 a.m., the president dies. Anybody want to guess how old President Lincoln was when he died? 56. He's 56. So at 7 a.m. his breathing slows, and at 7:22 a.m. President Abraham Lincoln dies at the age of 56. He died surrounded by friends and members of his cabinet, and the nation reeled in shock and disbelief. How many assassinations had we had prior to Abraham Lincoln? 0. This is our first presidential assassination. And the nation was in shock and disbelief. Now this is kind of interesting. Shortly after President Lincoln was pronounced dead, and they put the coins on his eyes, that's what they do so your eyelids don't, that's what they did in those days. Sometimes you die, your eyelids stay open, they close the eyelids, and they put coins on your eyes. Keep your eyes shut. Shortly after that happened, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton made a very famous quote at the death of President Lincoln. So again, shortly after President Lincoln was pronounced dead and the coins were placed on his eyes, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stated the following. I want you to write it down. He states, "Now he belongs to the ages." So again, shortly after Lincoln was pronounced dead and the coins were placed upon his eyelids, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stated, "Now he belongs to the ages." Edwin Stanton turned out to not be a very big supporter of Lincoln, and you'll hear more about him later when we get into the situation that President Andrew Johnson is going to have to inherit now of getting the civilians and the states back into the Union. But what we'll start tomorrow in our lecture will be the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. We got to go find this man that assassinated the President of the United States, and that is what we will start with tomorrow.